But the government did cruise to a fairly comfortable victory. That, however, is very far from the end of the story, because after that vote, MPs piled into the vote office to table a whole host of amendments. I think at last count, something like 136 different amendments have been tabled to this legislation. Everything from giving MPs a final say on the Brexit deal to MPs deciding how long the transition period should be. Also, a lot of concern about the powers ministers have given themselves to shape legislation as it is transferred from EU law into British law. Now, one of those MPs who's tabled amendment concerned about that is the former Conservative MP, Minister John Penrose, who joins me now. The argument of ministers is that this is nothing to get steamed up about. This is just a fairly technical, procedural issue of enabling ministers to quickly and easily do a little nip and tuck with some of the transfer of legislation from Europe.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the vast majority of the changes that are going to be necessary, I think they're absolutely right. And the premium then will be on speed and getting this huge volume of technical, tiny things through Parliament in time for Brexit Day. But there'll be a few. There'll be a few changes which are more than just tiny and technical, and we need to have some mechanism for picking those out of the hundreds of others and making sure they get proper scrutiny, so Parliament is actually doing its job of checking to make sure that ministers are behaving themselves.
Well, give us a sense of what sort of areas you think MPs are going to have to take a look at, and how are they going to do that without wasting an inordinate amount of time?
Well, the answer is that for the genuinely technical, tiny stuff, they can go through on a quick fire procedure. It's often used in Parliament, called a negative process. But for a few, particularly if there's some big changes which are agreed in the exit negotiations themselves, and therefore the laws have to change because that's what we've agreed with Europe as we go, then those will require changes. It isn't just a question of cutting and pasting stuff that's already in place in Europe and plonking it down in Britain. That will require a genuine change. Those kinds of things I think people will rightly want to have a proper look at, and we just need to make sure that those don't muck up the smooth passage of everything else.
And what happens if the government say, well, that's fine, but sorry, we really don't have time for that? In other words, they give you the cold shoulder.
Well, I think that this is something which they're already signalling they are wanting to listen. They want to be understanding and to make sure that they take this into account. And they've already said that they don't want this to be a power grab. David Davis has said it isn't a power grab, and all this is doing is just saying, well, here's a nice straightforward way of dealing with those accusations without holding the thing up. Some people are trying to use this as a mechanism for stopping Brexit actually quietly without actually admitting that they want to do that. I don't think we need to go anything like that far. We need to get Brexit through, and we need to make sure that people who are trying to derail it don't get that chance.
Given that we know what more than 130 amendments have already been tabled, how significant is the danger that this legislation could get snarled up, even derailed?
Well, that's the danger I was talking about, that some people who actually are quietly trying to stop Brexit in its tracks are trying to use this as an excuse. And what I'm saying is, no, you can deal with this problem of Henry VIII clauses, as they're called, quickly and efficiently without derailing it. But you're right, that is the danger. With 130 something amendments, if we don't get this done fast, then we won't hit the deadline, and that will be disastrous.
And more broadly, we know there are 7 other Brexit bills lined up which have to be pushed through probably by next summer. Is there any prospect that that is going to be possible?
I think it's perfectly possible, but it does require people not to hyperventilate or not to try and stop Brexit by stealth. Both of those things would be dangerous.
Let me just ask you one other story which is emerging. We know we're going to get a statement, a written statement from the Chancellor this afternoon, likely to be on moves to end the public sector pay cap for the police and prison service. Politically, if that is the case, how significant a moment is that?
Well, you're right, we will have to wait and see what's in the statement, but if you're right, I think people have been saying for some time that the pay cap was introduced because public sector pay back in 2007 had run ahead of private sector workers who were, after all, paying the taxes to fund the public sector. At some point, that imbalance will have levelled off, and at that point I think everyone's saying it's a question of when that moment is hit, we're going to have to remove it. Whether or not that happens later on this afternoon, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, John Penrose, thanks very much indeed. We will indeed. Cabinet still going on, so we should perhaps wait until that is over to see whether we get any formal announcement. But as I say, a written statement is penciled in by the Chancellor later on today on the public sector, which we're all kind of assuming will be about pay.